Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Ryan White, rooted in Torah Ministries. This week we're in the Torah portion Vaera, which is Exodus 6, verse 2 through 9, verse 35. And this is where we start to really see the plague starting to play out and such. And what we're really going to look at today is the issue of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. This is something that people have unfortunately found problems with for a couple thousand years. And realistically, one of the biggest issues is that we're trying to impose some sort of a cultural morals that we have onto the text that's not concerned necessarily with the same cultural values. And that is, of course, the idea of free will. Does God give everyone free will? And the answer, as we kind of experience in our lives is yes, we have free will. And oftentimes, there's this theological debate because Paul, I believe it's in his letter to the Romans, or one of his letters, he makes some comments that make it seem as though it's possible that everything is foreordained. So you've got the idea of predestination versus free will. And so this debate then gets shifted back to our very Torah portion where Pharaoh appears to be a puppet. But what I'm going to propose to you is that the story being told here of the Exodus and the plagues and such is being told in a certain manner, right? And this is the thing with the Bible, is that the Bible uses history to tell a story, right? It's not that it's non-historical, but it's taking history and it's trying to tell us a certain story. It's trying to teach us about our God. It's trying to teach us about our relationship with God and so on and so forth, and our relationship with one another. And so the thing is that oftentimes these stories are written from a certain angle and with certain goals of the story, and they're not intended to be used, for example, to debate free will versus predestination. We're taking a problem or a discussion that existed starting off with the early AD period, the early church father period. They started having these debates, and the thing I'm going to propose to you is that we really shouldn't be looking towards this Torah portion, because what I'm going to show you is how culturally the whole idea of hardening of Pharaoh's hearts would have actually been understood when we go back to the culture and the context that this story comes from, right? And it's only through that we can really understand the true power of what's being told here. And as I was studying this, it's just absolutely amazing and fascinating the message that's being played out here and how important this message would have been to the Israelites coming out of Egypt. So, before we begin, let's start by blessing our Creator for this week's wonderful Torah portion. And it reads, Baruch et Adonai hamvarak, Baruch Adonai hamvarak leolam vaed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim ve'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen and amen. All right, so we begin this Torah portion in Exodus 6, verse 2, and it's interesting because here we see that it begins with the revelation of who God is. God further spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, right? And here, if we look at this in our Hebrew here, you can see this is the divine name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? And he says, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, or in our Hebrew, this is El Shaddai, right? If we go here, we can look here, we got El, right, and Shaddai. But by my name, the Lord, or Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, I did not make myself known to them, and I'm about to establish my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land which they sojourn, right? And so sometimes this is a little side subject here, but sometimes this is kind of taken out of context, and they say, oh, well, you see the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they did not know the four-letter name of God. He only revealed it to Moses and to Israel coming out of Egypt. That's not accurate if we're to believe what our Bible actually tells us, because if we read the story of the narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see it's not just the person narrating the story of their lives, but they themselves are using the four-letter Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh name. So how is it that God didn't make his name known to them? What's going on here? This is something that we're really going to explore furthermore, especially when we get to the Torah portion Yitro, which is dealing with the Ten Commandments and taking the Lord's name in vain. I'm going to propose to you that if we actually study out the context here, the name is not about pronunciation, and it never has been. The name is about authority and about purpose and about mission. It's about what you're doing. Right? This is why our Messiah, Yeshua, was never called Yeshua prior to his birth. Why is that? Because prior to his birth, whatever pre-existing form he had was not really revealed to us. And in fact, now that we know him, we see aspects of him in the angel of the covenant that went before them and so on and so forth. But he's not given the name Yeshua until he's born of Mary and Joseph. Why does he need to be given that name? Because the name tells you what he's doing, right? Yeshua's name means salvation. And his mission when he was born in human form is the mission of salvation of Israel and ultimately of all of humanity. So this is why his name became important there. Here, we've got the same thing going on. To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he was known as El Shaddai. El Shaddai means God Almighty, it's translated, but it means the provider. He's giving them provision, and we see that in the stories, but the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is tied to covenant, right? And while Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did receive covenant promises, they didn't actually receive covenant fulfillment of those blessings. But Israel is about to go to the land, which is the covenant fulfillment of the covenant promises. And so now the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh becomes important with them because that name is tied in not only with covenant, but with covenant mercy. The word in Hebrew is chesed, covenant loyalty. It may, oftentimes you'll see it translated as loving kindness or mercy or so on and so forth. But it really means is God's loyalty to his covenant promises. And those covenant promises are tied in with his name, right? So his revealing to them is about, as you see here in verse 4, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, right? And so God is about to fulfill this covenant promise. And this is why he's revealing himself in this specific name. Okay, so what follows here, and this is important for us to understand, what follows here is God revealing his name not only to Israel, but he's going to reveal it to Pharaoh, because there's another side to his name. The name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is tied in with his essence, with his power, and with his authority. And he's about to reveal that to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians, and to the whole world. And guess what? Those who come against his power and his authority, they're not going to like it. They're going to begin living in a sort of hell. And that's what we see unfolding here. And so as the Lord is revealing himself, he also not just reveals he exists, but he has to reveal his power and his authority. And you realize in this day and time, they all believed in all sorts of gods. There was the god of the Nile. There was the god of the sun. There was the god of justice. They made gods for everything. And living in Egypt for this many years, we've got to realize the Israelites, more than likely, now we can't prove this, but you can't disprove it, right? The biblical narrative really doesn't tell us the spiritual condition prior to that, but we can kind of see it playing out on the back end, right? They get out into the wilderness and suddenly they want a golden calf and so on and so forth. And, so realistically, we've got to realize that Israel has taken on, more than likely, a lot of the pagan culture that they lived in. We see this every time people go into dispersion, they're not living in their own land, they start taking on aspects of the culture, and these cultures heavily emphasized deities. And so God has to, part of his saving them from Israel is he's got to save the hearts and minds as well. He's got to not only pull them out of Egypt, but pull the Egypt out of them, so to speak. He's got to show them that he is the one that they must serve. Not these other gods, not Ra, not Osiris, none of these gods they're all fake, right? They're all fake. And on top of that, who was the most visible god to the Egyptians? It was Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh himself was considered a god. I want to show you, this is a inscription that they have found. This is you can find the copy of this along with the reference for it in John Currid's article, Why Did God Harden Pharaoh's Heart? It's part of the Biblical Archaeological Society's articles database here. So he says, worship Pharaoh Ni Ma'at Ra. Now if you notice, Ma'at was a god and Ra was a god. So this Pharaoh is named after these gods, Ni Ma'at Ra. Living forever within your bodies, and associate his majesty in your hearts. Notice the hearts there. He is Ra, by whose beams one sees. He is one who illumines the two lands more than the sun disk. And so in this inscription, we see this claim that the Pharaoh, the king, right, because a Pharaoh is a king, Pharaoh is a god, and moreover, he is Ra to the people. He's the image of Ra, if you will. He's the one who represents Ra to the people, and so it makes the statement about he is the one who illuminates the two lands. Realize that you got Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, so you got two lands combined into one kingdom, and it's saying this Pharaoh is like a god, and he illuminates the land even more than the sun. All right, and so we see that there was a lot of divine worship of Caesar himself in there, and moreover, we also see that Pharaoh's symbol of power was the uraeus, or the serpent. If you remember, they had the little serpent on the headdress, right? That is what symbolizes Pharaoh's godhood and his power. And what's interesting, what's the very first sign that we see? The very first confrontation, should I say, that we see between our God and this Egyptian false god. It's where Moses throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, and Pharaoh's magicians, they're able to do the same thing. Wow, great magic trick. Guess what? Our God is more powerful. The serpent that he causes to form from this staff consumes those other two. And so really, the real essence of that story right there was not so much about being able to do a magic trick. It was about that serpent overpowering the others, showing the power over them. And we see this is kind of becomes the theme throughout all of these plagues, is that each of these plagues goes after one of the certain gods of Egypt, right? For example, the sun being darkened. This is the going after the sun god Ra, right? Basically, the idea was that Ra would rise, and the sun would rise, and so when one day suddenly the sun doesn't rise, wow, there's a god who actually has control over the sun god, which, as we just read there, is also basically Pharaoh's patron god as well. So we see this kind of attack on all these gods, and especially on Pharaoh, because more important than disproving all these other gods that they have not seen, what's most important is to discredit and shame this God that they had seen, this Pharaoh, this God king that they all looked up to and essentially worshipped. And so while God, our God, is concerned about shaming all these other gods, he is most concerned with shaming Pharaoh, with showing his complete ineptness, that he has no real power. And so this goes back to this whole idea of God hardening the heart of Pharaoh. We look at this and we say, oh, how could God control someone and force him to do these things? Well, we've also got our God slaughtering innocent babies, the firstborn males of Egypt, are also slaughtered. We've got to look at, what is worse? God killing a bunch of infants or Pharaoh being controlled like a puppet? So if we're going to look at moral grounds, we've got bigger issues. And realistically, when we look at these and we really understand who God is, it does not become an issue, because ultimately, why do these children die? Because of their parents. Their parents, we can see in the story that the parents are essentially given an out. If the parents would just have listened to the Israelites, let us go, put some blood on your doorpost, they could have prevented their own children's death. Pharaoh could have prevented them. So first off, we've got this whole idea of our moral ground is kind of, not the best way to look at this to begin with. Second off, we've got to consider this. We've got three primary verbs being used here. The first one, actually the most frequent one, is the verb chazak. Chazak, which means to be strong or to be strengthened. We see this, for example, in Joshua 11, verse 20, where the Lord gives the Canaanites a strong desire to fight in battle against the Israelites. So thus the Canaanites get wiped out, right? And so God and the text kind of goes back and forth. Sometimes it's Pharaoh who strengthens his own heart. Sometimes God strengthens Pharaoh's heart. And it seems to kind of be this building up in this repetition. But let me present you with a different perspective. See, we're looking at it through the eyes of believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're looking at it as people who know the ultimate outcome. Think about the Egyptians in Egypt who own these slaves. Would they prefer their king be strong-willed, that he be chazak, that he be, that he would say, no, you're not going to take them out? Or would they prefer a weak king? Everyone wants a strong leader, right? The Egyptians, they want a strong leader because they want to keep their slaves. They want to keep their servants. So from an Egyptian perspective, Pharaoh's heart being strengthened is a good thing, because now they have a strong leader. His heart is not melting at this God of the slaves. He's standing up. They've got a leader that they're proud of. And so Pharaoh's heart is in part a measure of the Egyptian hearts as well, I'd propose to you. I don't think it was just Pharaoh who was saying, we need to keep our slaves. The Egyptians did not want to give up their lifestyle. You got to think about this. We live in a society with all of our things. Imagine if God said that your electronics are slaves and you need to let your electronics go. I know that's a kind of absurd example, but bear with me here. How hard would it be for you to give up every single piece of electronic equipment in your house? For some of you, it may be very easy. For me, it would be very hard. I like my electronics. I like being able to sit in my house and record videos and so on and so forth. For them to give up their slaves, they are going to be giving up their lifestyle. They're going to be giving up the person cleaning their house. They're going to be giving up the people building their cities. Now they're going to have to go out and build their own cities. They're going to have to go out and harvest their own food, make their own bricks, things like this. They are going to have to do things themselves. And so I would propose to you that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is a reflection of the people themselves. But it says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, which is interesting because, again, from an Egyptian's perspective, not only do they want Pharaoh to be a strong leader, but think about this. If they're hearing that the God of the Hebrews forced Pharaoh's heart to become hard, Pharaoh turns out to not be a god himself, but to be merely a puppet of the Hebrew God. Do you see how that would come across to them? Oh, you've got this great, wonderful king. He thinks he's a god. Well, guess what? He's nothing but a puppet of our God. So rather than being concerned with free will versus predestination and God pulling all the strings, this is not something that they're concerned with. This is not something that the person writing the story to us is trying to, play against each other. He's trying to show us that our God, the Lord, Yod-He Vav-He, the one whose name is being revealed, has control over the most powerful man in the world at this point in time. You got to realize Egypt was one of the most powerful nations in the entire world. And the most powerful man in Egypt is nothing but a puppet. God does with him as he wishes. He controls him like the little marionettes or whatever they are. Think about that message. Now we don't have to worry about whether there's free will and predestination, all those things. These arguments are not what's being addressed. What's being addressed to the people of Israel, that the God who is rescuing them is the Almighty. That they need to forsake all these other gods, including Pharaoh, because our God controls everything. Amen? All right, let's look at some of these other verbs that are being used here. We've got the verb kasa, which means to be difficult. This is only used twice here. The one that I really wanted to kind of focus in on for the rest of the time here, though, is the verb kaved, which means to make heavy, right? So you've got to be strengthened, to be difficult, and to be heavy. Now, this heaviness is an attitude, or is an emphasis on Pharaoh's attitude rather than on his actions. And it says that his heart was made heavy. Now, to us, we look at this and we say, okay, well, I realize that this is a metaphor, right? This didn't literally mean that his literal heart started becoming weighted down. But I want to propose to you that the Egyptians may have seen this in a different perspective, because they were extremely obsessed with the heart. I want to read to you from this is from the Memphite theology. This is a inscription. Let me pull it up here. An inscription that is found in the British Museum it's called the Shabaka stone. The Shabaka stone, if you see this here. And by the way, you can find this. This is in the book Ancient Near Eastern Texts by James Pritchard. If you want to study ancient Near Eastern culture and context, this is an absolutely necessary reference book here. So I'm going to be pulling this up in Logos here. And so you can see this is talking about live the Horus who prospers the lands, blah, 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 blah. Again, you can read this if you get the book. It's really important to read this sort of stuff to get kind of a cultural background. But for time's sake, I'm going to skip down here to this part I highlighted here. It says, thus all the gods were formed, and his Ennead, if that's how you pronounce it, was completed. Now this Ennead thing, this is basically a sort of a divine council, if you will. This is the pantheon of the gods. And look at what it says here. Indeed, all the divine order really came into being through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. So the thought of the heart and the word of the mouth. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. All right, you see that kind of concept there of the heart being important. And so what we've got to realize is that in Egyptian culture, and this is also in Hebrew culture as well, in the Bible, there is the heavy emphasis on the heart as being the spiritual seat, if you will, of intellect, of emotion, and volition, i.e. your willpower. Your heart is your decision maker. So to love God with all your heart doesn't mean that you have strong feelings and you just get kind of goosebumps or a warm sensation when you think about him. To love God with all your heart means that your decisions, your willpower, your thought processes are filtered through your devotion, your dedication, your love. That's what love really means, is devotion and dedication. Your love for God. So your heart is your decision maker. Now, in Egyptian culture, the heart was even more heavily emphasized. The heart was, as you see here, it was the place of divine order. Pharaoh's heart was seen. By the way, this was referring to the gods having their heart was what brought about divine order. And later on, you could see that the heart of Pharaoh was seen as possessing this power of order, of justice, and these sorts of things. And ultimately, the heart was the seat of destiny. Okay, the seat of destiny. Now, what I want to put up here on the screen for you, and please pay attention to this if you are able to here. This is from this is a very famous piece of art. You can actually find this by Google searching it as well. This is the scene of what happens when a person dies. This is from the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds commentary on Exodus. Now, what you see in this scene is on your left-hand side here, you see this kind of jackal-headed being. He is leading a person by the hand. This person has just become deceased. And if you can look really closely there on the screen, you'll see that he's holding an ankh. An ankh is the Egyptian symbol of life. Now, in this scene, you then have this person's heart. You see the scale there, right? So this person's heart is placed on the left-hand side of this scale, and a feather is placed on the right-hand side. And you can see up at the top of the scale, you have this little figure with a feather coming out. That figure represents Ma'at, who is the god, the goddess, should I say, of justice. The goddess of justice. And you've got this person recording, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting is that they believed that when you died, Anubis would lead you to the scales of Ma'at, and he would take your heart out and place it on the scales. And if your heart weighed more than this feather, this meant you led an evil, wicked, unjust life, and this dog, Amit, the devourer, would consume you and eat you, and you would be denied the afterlife. If your heart weighed less than a feather, well, you're good to go. You get to enter the afterlife. So it's interesting. God said he made Pharaoh's heart heavy. And for them, a heavy heart means unjust, cruel, wicked, being denied the afterlife. And it's interesting that this Pharaoh actually dies where? In the Red Sea. Thus, his body is not found, or if it was found, it would have been probably weeks later, and you couldn't embalm it. He was being literally denied the afterlife in their culture because they didn't believe you could go to the afterlife without being embalmed and entombed and so on and so forth. So it's really cool what our God does when we understand the cultural context there and how our God is showing the Israelites it's not Pharaoh who you got to worry about, who you got to serve. It's me. Amen? Let's finish by blessing our wonderful Creator. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata beitokenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha-Torah. I pray that you got a blessing out of this, and I hope that you join us again next week. Until next time, may Yah bless you and keep you. Shalom, everyone.